What Baba Vanga predicted for Venezuela in 2026 is happening right now. That sentence sounds impossible until you trace the trail. An allegedly secret trance recorded in Bulgaria in the mid-1990s, cryptic images about a land of black gold, a reference to a water dragon year, a wind that comes from the north, and a woman who appears like Joan of Arc. Taken together, as some investigators and witnesses insist, those images sketch a political turning point for Venezuela whose appointed year is 2026. Today, months before that year arrives, people on the ground and observers abroad are pointing to a string of events that seem to echo elements of that vision. In this video, I'll walk you through the archive claims, the symbolic decoding, and the concrete parallels we can already observe, always flagging where evidence ends and interpretation begins. If you want the full investigative breakdown, like and subscribe. There are two ways to begin, with the woman who couldn't see, and with the man who wrote what she said. Baba Vanga, a seer born in what is now North Macedonia and who lived most of her life in Bulgaria, built a reputation in Eastern Europe as someone who spoke of things ahead of their time. For decades, people brought her questions about health, war, and leadership. Many accounts describe her as blunt and singularly focused when she spoke, and over time a kind of archive of her predictions grew around her. Those archives are messy: tape recordings, notebooks, testimonies from relatives and aides. Among the names that surface repeatedly in discussions of those later records is Dimitar Markov, described in several sources as a close aide and secretary who transcribed sessions and helped catalog notes. The Bulgarian Institute of Paranormal Phenomena, a small organization that houses collections related to local psychic research, is the center point in most retellings, the place where, according to some, a selection of trance notes and files were kept. All of that is background to a single intense trance session said to have taken place in 1995 and 1996. The records attributed to that period are not a tidy prophecy written in plain prose. They are fragments, images, metaphors, a few temporal markers. What makes them unusual, to those who study them, is the specificity of certain motifs. A reference to a leader described as a mustached man in a nation of black gold, a repeated mention of a year associated with a water dragon, the image of winds arriving from the north, and the apparition of a woman likened to Joan of Arc, who appears among people wearing white. There are also notes in various transcriptions that point to a third month and to an astronomical sign. The texts, as preserved by some witnesses, seem to link political events with celestial markers. Because this material sits at the intersection of mysticism and geopolitics, it is important to separate what the documents allegedly say from the ways people have read them. According to the files, and I want to emphasize according to, the central time marker used in the trance is tied to an image interpreted by later readers as the year of the water dragon. Investigators who have studied the material map that phrase to a specific year on the Chinese zodiac cycle, and the number they arrive at in public discussions is 2026. From that point on, interpretive frameworks diverge. One set of readers treats the dragon reference as a symbolic pointer to a date. Others treat it more loosely, as a period of elemental upheaval associated with water, power, and transformation. The visual metaphors in the trance are no less charged. The mustached man ruling a land of black gold feels less like an abstract symbol and more like a portrait. In conversations and public pieces about the files, that phrase has been associated with Venezuela's long dependence on oil and with a leader who has cultivated a strongman image. Another recurring motif, winds from the north, has been widely read as shorthand for external pressure or influence, often framed in geopolitical terms. Some interpreters point to shifts in U.S. politics and foreign policy as the likely referent. Others caution that north could mean many things: ideological change, economic pressure, or even an inland shift in alliances. The woman like Joan of Arc is perhaps the most dramatic image. Joan of Arc conjures martyrdom, moral clarity, and a kind of charismatic leadership that crosses religious and national boundaries. To read a modern Latin American political figure into that image is to make a leap. Yet that is precisely what a number of commentators have done, naming opposition leaders as possible embodiments of the figure described in the trance. There are practical reasons this set of files has drawn attention now. First, the political landscape in Venezuela since 2019 and particularly in 2024 has been tense in ways that naturally encourage pattern seeking. Reports of mass mobilizations, contested electoral cycles, and a visible civic awakening have created a context in which symbolic readings are easily amplified. Second, the years immediately preceding 2026 have produced a number of events that, when filtered through the trance's images, seem to line up. Protests and electoral activity, the sudden prominence of female opposition figures, anecdotal claims of social and natural anomalies, and public debates about alliances and foreign pressure. Third, the trance's reference to celestial signs, which some supporters say match observable astronomical events, lends the account a theatrical quality, a prophecy grounded not only in metaphor, but in the sky. All of this is why, when the archive fragments were referred to in media and online discussions, a chain reaction began. Investigators who have spent time with the purported files argue that they are neither wholly non-specific nor purely retrospective reconstructions. They point to handwritten timestamps and marginal notes that, as they read them, indicate contemporaneous recording. Skeptics reply that any vague prophecy can be retrofitted to many outcomes, and that at least some of the markings could have been augmented later. Those tensions about provenance and timing are a crucial part of the story. The claims depend not only on the imagery, but on whether the trance records were preserved in the form they were spoken, and whether the timestamps hold. We should be clear about the line between fact and interpretation here. It is a fact that documents attributed to Baba Vanga exist in certain Bulgarian collections, and that Dimitar Markov is repeatedly named in accounts as a transcriber or attendant. It is also a fact that the trance materials contain phrases and descriptions that people have parsed into political images. What is less verifiable is whether the files were intentionally suppressed, whether the marginal notes were made contemporaneously, and whether the descriptive language was intended to point explicitly to a country such as Venezuela. Those are matters of interpretation and, in some cases, of contested archival provenance. When investigators map the trance imagery to Venezuela, they do so through a series of symbolic translations. Black gold is an easy connection to make to oil, especially when the nation at the center of debate is one whose history and economy are tightly bound to petroleum. The mustached leader becomes a shorthand for an entrenched figure of authority. The woman like Joan of Arc becomes a candidate for a moralized opposition symbol. The winds from the north are read as external political forces that could tip the balance either by isolating the regime or by applying pressure that reshapes political calculations. The water dragon year functions as a calendar anchor, a signifier that some researchers correlate with 2026 and therefore use to build a timeline from the mid-1990s trance to events in the present decade. It's worth slowing down on that conversion from image to date because it reveals how fragile any prophetic reading can be. The phrase water dragon is not the same as a Gregorian calendar date. To connect it to 2026 requires adopting a specific calendrical framework, the Chinese zodiac cycle, and choosing a particular interpretive route. Even within that route, there are choices. Do you read the dragon literally as the Chinese element of water paired with the dragon sign? Or do you treat water as an elemental hint and dragon as a symbol of upheaval? Those choices matter because they shape how one predicts timing and consequence. Investigators who favor a literal mapping argue that the trance's wording is precise enough to warrant the match, and that additional marginal notes about a third month strengthen the case by suggesting a narrower window. Others argue that the trance was intentionally poetic and that the human tendency is to narrow meaning in hindsight. Beyond that technical debate, the ways in which the trance's images seem to appear in public life are what makes the files feel urgent to many observers. Consider the pattern. In 2024, a series of protests and electoral maneuvers received international attention. Opposition figures, some with profiles that emphasize women's leadership, rose into broader public awareness. Networks of civic organization and grassroots protest coalesced around calls for change. Reported social phenomena, things like residents claiming to see unusual bird migrations or flowering out of season, were circulated in local networks and then amplified online. Astronomical coincidences became another thread. The trance mentions a celestial sign. Some commentators point to documented eclipses or planetary alignments as possible matches. At every step there is an interpretive leap, between the trance's image and the map to the present, between the symbolic and the literal, between the archive and the event. But the accumulation of those perceived parallels is persuasive to many. Let's look at the human dimension for a moment. People who live through long periods of crisis develop a particular hunger for patterns and hope. In Venezuela, years of economic hardship and political polarization have done more than shift statistics. They have reshaped daily life and the ways people imagine possible futures. When a narrative emerges that combines the possibility of a peaceful transition, a symbolic leader who stands for moral renewal, and a specified time frame, it resonates emotionally. That resonance does not prove the prophecy. It explains why the trance materials attract attention and why, for many Venezuelans and for observers across Latin America and the diaspora, the story becomes a lens through which to view current events. At the same time, there are reasons for caution that cannot be dismissed. Prophetic narratives have historically been used by diverse actors, sometimes to inspire, sometimes to manipulate. The very specificity of the trance's images makes them powerful and simultaneously malleable. Political actors and their supporters may seize on certain phrases to rally, while opponents will dismiss the same phrases as opportunistic. Importantly, the archival claims themselves are contested. While some scholars and journalists say the Bulgarian Institute holds relevant files, others note gaps in public documentation and the lack of independent full-text releases that would allow for rigorous verification. Allegations that the files were suppressed or that diplomatic pressure was applied to keep them quiet do appear in several retellings. Those allegations are serious and deserve scrutiny, but they are, in most cases, presented as claims rather than established fact. There is a practical, non-mystical side to the matter as well. Even if one accepts the trance's dating and symbolism at face value, the question remains, how would such a prophecy translate into political action? The vision, as reported, describes scenes of people in white, a woman who speaks with moral clarity, a short period of silence, and, crucially, a non-violent collapse of an entrenched leadership. Translating those images into a concrete scenario involves assumptions about the behavior of institutions, the loyalty of security forces, and the role of international actors. Analysts who are skeptical point out that political transitions are rarely as cinematic as prophecy suggests. They are messy, contingent processes in which chance, strategic missteps, and improvisation matter. Those analysts urge a focus on material indicators, economic stress, elite fragmentation, military cohesion, and international pressure, factors that can be observed and measured independently of symbolic readings. Yet symbolic narratives can alter behavior in exactly these material domains. A prophecy that gains traction in public discourse can influence morale, encourage solidarity among opposition groups, or even change the calculus of third-party actors watching from abroad. In that sense, prophecy is not simply a map drawn before events unfold. It can be a force that shapes the terrain. Here lies the tension at the heart of the archive story. If the trance is authentic and is believed, it could contribute to the very dynamics it predicts. If it is a retrospective fitting of images to events, it still matters because it shapes expectations and actions. Against that background, specific names and figures enter the conversation. One opposition leader is frequently cited by interpreters as resembling the woman like Joan of Arc image from the trance. That name, a prominent female politician whose emergence in recent years has been marked by public rallies and a hardline stance against the incumbent administration, is invoked in many commentaries. The fit is not perfect. Prophecy by definition speaks in archetypes, and archetypes invite projection. Some readers point to her rhetoric and public persona as matching the moral clarity and combative posture associated with Joan of Arc. Others caution that equating a living political figure with a prophetic archetype is a fraught exercise. It moralizes politics and elevates an individual to a symbolic plane that may not match complex political realities. The archive's references to winds from the north complicate things further because they implicate external actors without naming them. To many analysts, this phrase evokes pressure from the United States or shifting policies from powerful northern neighbors. That interpretation sits alongside a more cautious reading that sees the phrase as metaphorical for a larger impersonal movement of pressure, economic levers, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or even a change in the global oil market. In practical terms, external pressure can be decisive. Sanctions or changes in diplomatic posture can affect domestic calculations about the cost of holding power. But it is important to avoid simplistic causal claims. The files, as presented by those who reference them, suggest a confluence of internal awakening and external winds, rather than a single deterministic cause. Among the more evocative motifs in the trance are the images that suggest atmospheric and biological shifts. Birds changing their routes, flowers blooming at odd times, a strange quiet before a storm. These are the kinds of signs that travel quickly in local communities and online networks because they are tangible yet ambiguous. A flock of birds moving differently one season can be a meteorological anomaly, a response to climate change, or simply a coincidental pattern. For believers and investigators looking for confirmation, such signs are seductive because they appear to cross the boundary between symbolic language and physical reality. That said, as investigators themselves often point out, correlation is not causation. A change in bird migration does not prove a prophecy. It is a data point to be examined, not a verdict. Astronomical details in the trance add another layer of complexity. The files, as discussed by those who have seen or described them, mention a sky-born sign, some sort of celestial configuration that would accompany or mark the prophetic moment. Astronomers can verify eclipses, transits, and alignments, and indeed celestial events are catalogued to a high degree of precision. When commentators claim a match between recorded astronomical events and the trance's references, that claim becomes potentially verifiable. The difficulty lies in the vagueness of the language and the absence of a complete public transcript in many cases. A mention of a sign in the sky can apply to many different astronomical occurrences. A match across both text and date requires close comparison that so far remains inconclusive in the public record. Still, what has raised the level of attention recently is not only the content of the trance, but the timing. With 2026 identified by many interpreters as the relevant year, the lead-up period has taken on a countdown quality. Small events, a spike in protest activity, an economic uptick, public demonstrations of support or isolation, get framed as potential harbingers. Media cycles, social platforms, and diaspora communities pick up on these connections, amplifying them. For many Venezuelans, and for the wider Latin American public, the story is not merely an abstract curiosity. It carries stakes, the possibility of significant change, the promise of peaceful transition, and the question of what regional consequences might follow if a shift occurs. We are, however, at a moment of accumulation rather than resolution. The trance's images, the archival fragments, and the present-day events form a cluster of possibilities. None yet constitutes definitive proof that the specific outcomes described will occur, nor that they will follow the exact sequence inferred by some readers. What we can map with greater confidence is how these narratives are influencing perception and behavior. That influence is real. It shapes protests, informs political messaging, and enters diplomatic conversations indirectly. Whether that influence will tip the balance toward the outcome imagined in the trance is an open question. There is another quieter dimension to this story that bears emphasis. The people who would be most affected by any political turning point are not theorists and commentators, but those who live day to day under the conditions the prophecy addresses. In neighborhoods where blackouts, shortages, and constrained mobility are daily realities, talk of prophetic timing is freighted with hope and anxiety. To suggest that a transitional moment could occur peacefully, and that it might be led by a moral figure who mobilizes civic energy rather than violence, is to offer a powerful narrative of redemption. To suggest instead that the prophecy will be overturned by geopolitical calculus or elite bargaining is to offer a different kind of realism. Both perspectives are part of the conversation, and both shape how communities prepare, pray, organize, and resist. Which brings us to the question of suppression and provenance again. Some sources claim that after the trance was recorded in 1995-1996, certain institutional actors in Bulgaria and beyond sought to limit public access to the files. Those claims have been framed as the result of diplomatic caution, officials worried about interference or about the international implications of widely circulated prophetic claims. or as routine archival management. Others suggest a more active suppression, pressure from foreign ministries, quiet requests to restrict access, or the slow attrition of records through poor preservation. These are weighty allegations, and in most public accounts they are presented as claims to be investigated rather than as established history. The truth is probably complex. Archives are messy, and documents can be lost, misfiled, or withheld for many administrative reasons. The presence of any attempted suppression would not prove the content of the prophecy any more than the absence of suppression would disprove it. What it would indicate is that the prophecy, or the rumor of it, affected political sensibilities enough to prompt an institutional response. By now, the pattern in public conversation looks like this: an old trance with vivid images, an interpretive map that ties those images to Venezuela, real-world events in 2024 and 2025 that some read as signaling a build-up, and a narrow window around 2026 that many watch with a mixture of hope and apprehension. There is also a third actor in this dynamic: the international audience, including diasporas, foreign governments, and analysts, who watches for signs, struggles to separate hype from evidence, and occasionally amplifies one narrative or another. The presence of this global audience changes the stakes. A prophecy that crosses borders becomes part of the diplomatic and informational environment, and that changes the incentives for political actors at home. As we move closer to the dates highlighted by interpreters, the debate intensifies. On one side are those who point to the archive fragments and the pattern of present events as cause for cautious optimism. If the prophecy's core promise is a peaceful, popular reassertion of civic will, rather than a violent overthrow, then its fulfillment would be profoundly consequential for Venezuela and for the region. On the other side are those who urge skepticism, reminding observers that political change is messy, that prophecies frequently fail, and that interpretive biases are powerful, especially when they offer solace in difficult times. What the trance does, in effect, is compress multiple narratives into a single story. It merges historical grievance, political aspiration, symbolic leadership, and cosmological sign into a framework that many find compelling. For analysts, the challenge is to unpack that compression and test each component against verifiable indicators: the chain of custody for the documents, the timeline of recorded notes, the behavior of security forces, economic and social metrics, and the role of international actors. For the public, the challenge is different: to balance the human desire for hope with the need for sober assessment. There is one dimension we have not yet fully explored that deserves attention before we proceed further: the regional domino effect alluded to in the trance's readings. The idea is straightforward: a dramatic change in Venezuela, especially one that is peaceful and seen as legitimate by a large portion of the population, could ripple across neighboring countries. That ripple would not be a simplistic contagion, but a set of refracted consequences: shifts in migration flows, changes in diplomatic alignments, renewed investment and trade, and political emboldening for other movements. Whether such a ripple would be stabilizing or destabilizing depends heavily on how any transition unfolds and how regional governments respond. It also depends on the capacity of institutions to absorb sudden shifts without resorting to coercion or opportunistic grabs for power. If we pause here, at the moment where the threads of symbol, archive, and present events begin to converge, we can see why the story of the trance, even in its contested form, matters beyond curiosity. It is a narrative that offers a timeline, a set of images, and a possible script for change. It is also a narrative that, by circulating, may change incentives and alter behavior. The question is not merely whether the prophecy is true, but whether belief in the prophecy will shape the real world in ways that prove consequential. In the next segment, I will examine the most detailed accounts of the 2026 week that the files allegedly outline. The days when crowds in white gather, the period of silence that precedes a shift, how the military is said to respond, and what the documents describe about the emergence of a successor. I will also dig into the most concrete parallels from 2024-2025, specific protest episodes, reported shifts in political alignment, and the available astronomical records that people point to when making the case. Along the way, we'll weigh the evidentiary status of each claim and keep sight of the people whose lives would be transformed by any outcome. For now, take a moment to consider what drives our fixation on prophetic patterns. Is it the human love of narrative closure, the comfort of a timeline in a chaotic world, or the very real possibility that symbolic belief can move mountains, or at the least influence the decisions of those perched at the levers of power? Whatever the answer, the lead-up to 2026 has already remade parts of the conversation about Venezuela. Observers across the region are watching, and communities inside the country are both making meaning of the images and preparing in practical ways for a range of outcomes. Before we go further, one practical reminder. As you read and discuss this material, consider the difference between what is alleged in the archive and what independent evidence confirms. Treat archival claims as claims, not as settled history. Read witness reports with curiosity but also with caution. And keep in mind the human cost of chasing narratives. Real people endure hardship now, and any talk of prophetic timing is, for them, also talk about potential relief or further strain. In the next portion, I will lay out the trance's most detailed scene-by-scene reading, examine testimony about the 3-day silence and the crowd in white, and place those descriptions alongside verified events from the recent past. We will also take a closer look at how the international community has responded to these claims, not by endorsing or rejecting prophecy, but by adjusting policy and rhetoric in ways that can be directly observed. That comparison will help us move from interpretive speculation toward a map of concrete indicators that can be tested as the calendar approaches 2026. The scene the trance allegedly sketches begins with an image both small and cinematic. A sea of people clothed in white, moving through a city as if part of a single breath. According to the notes attributed to the 1995-1996 session, these gatherings are not chaotic mobs, but organized, solemn assemblies, not armed, but unmistakably determined. The files, as described by investigators and witnesses, emphasize the color white repeatedly, framing it as a symbol of moral clarity or peaceful intent rather than mere fashion. That detail matters because it turns what might be a spontaneous protest into something ritualized, a communal performance meant to communicate both refusal and dignity. The trance then narrows to a period described in marginal notes as a short silence, 3 days in which public noise recedes and authorities appear to hesitate. In the documents as reported, that silence is strikingly literal. Businesses slow, radio chatter dims, and an eerie civic calm settles over streets that had been noisy with dispute. Analysts who work with the materials interpret that pause as a hinge, a moment when ordinary mechanisms of control fray and choices that seemed impossible become thinkable. If one reads these passages as a political script, the 3 days function as an interlude during which loyalties are tested and the momentum of a movement either crystallizes or dissipates. What follows in the trance, according to those who have seen or described the notes, is the response of security forces. The files do not depict a dramatic battle, but rather a series of refusals. Units that hold their fire, commanders who withdraw or stand aside, and a gradual collapse of the coercive capacity that had seemed absolute. This element, the idea that the military or police will not unleash sustained violence against unarmed citizens, is essential to the prediction's claim of nonviolent transition. Interpreters point out that such behavior is contingent. It depends on internal fractures, on orders given and not executed, and on the calculations of officers who weigh personal risk, public opinion, and international consequences. In short, the documents envision a cascade of decisions inside security institutions, not a magical removal of power overnight. Into this institutionally fragile moment enters the figure of the woman like Joan of Arc. The trance's imagery, as paraphrased by record keepers, frames her in language of moral clarity, public appeal, and symbolic sacrifice. She is not described as a dictator in waiting, but as someone who articulates a collective moral demand. Readers who map this archetype onto present-day actors do so cautiously. They emphasize the role of rhetoric, public performance, and symbolic leadership, rather than supernatural authority. In practical terms, the files suggest that a leader with strong moral resonance could crystallize the civic energy of that moment and channel it toward nonviolent outcomes, negotiated exits, a reconfiguration of power, or a swift retreat by a beleaguered incumbent. The aftermath the trance sketches is swift and, in many ways, optimistic. The records, as interpreted, talk about a rapid turn toward reconstruction, markets reopening, international aid and investment following a period of clarity, and social measures meant to stabilize daily life. Some lines in the notes suggest a decade of healing, 10 years of transformation in which institutions rebuild, economic patterns shift, and the region adjusts to a new diplomatic reality. Interpreters treat this as aspirational and conditional. Those 10 years depend on competent governance, on avoiding vengeance politics, and on the international community providing room for reconstruction rather than punishment. So how do these alleged scenes line up with events we can independently observe in 2024 and 2025? Here the narrative turns from the cinematic to the documentary, from symbol to concrete indicator. Several episodes stand out in public reporting. Mass mobilizations in 2024 that gathered thousands in multiple cities, the heightened visibility of women in opposition leadership roles, and a series of electoral and legal maneuvers that some read as signaling elite divisions. These are verifiable phenomena. Protests occurred, certain political figures rose in prominence, and institutional tensions were reported by multiple outlets. What is less verifiable are the causal connections that link these events to prophetic expectation. Witness reports of unusual natural signs, birds shifting routes, unexpected blooms, have circulated in local networks and diaspora forums. Journalists have tracked many of these claims to social media posts and neighborhood testimonies. Scientists point out that migratory patterns and flowering times can shift in response to climate variability and habitat changes. They caution that such phenomena are not inherently prophetic. Still, these reports serve a social function. When communities facing hardship receive signals that can be read as confirmation, those signals help maintain momentum and shared belief. In other words, the material reality of environmental oddities can feed symbolic narratives even while remaining explicable through non-mystical mechanisms. Astronomical claims have been the most amenable to independent verification, in principle. The trance mentions a sign in the sky, and commentators have attempted to match that phrase to catalogued eclipses, transits, or planetary alignments. Public astronomy records are precise, and where a particular eclipse or alignment is claimed, it can be checked. The difficulty lies in the trance's language. Without a full authenticated transcript that pins a date to the celestial phrase, many matches are speculative. In short, where celestial events are invoked publicly as corroboration, the claim is either verifiable if a specific date is given, or remains an interpretive overlay if the description is vague. Another set of empirical markers that matter for any plausible transition are institutional. The cohesion of security forces, the disposition of elites, economic pressure points, and international posture. News reports and think tank assessments from the past 2 years document strains along these axes: budgetary stress, defections or public dissent among some officials, and fluctuating external policies. Such indicators are the kind analysts watch because they help explain the mechanics of political change. The trance's narrative is not, on its own, a substitute for these metrics. Rather, believers and investigators treat it as a parallel signal that may coincide with institutional fault lines. Part of the current debate concerns the possibility of interference, both the idea that external actors might seek to influence outcomes and the claim that previously such influences attempted to suppress disclosure of the trance files. Multiple public accounts reference diplomatic discomfort around prophetic claims, and some assert that foreign ministries or embassies lobbied archival institutions for restraint. These remain allegations in many retellings. Where documentation exists, it is often indirect. From a practical standpoint, even the rumor of suppression affects public perception. It feeds ideas of a hidden script, which in turn can intensify belief among those predisposed to see patterns. If one maps possible futures from the trance forward while honoring the constraints of history and political science, several scenarios emerge, all qualified, none guaranteed. The most optimistic scenario mirrors the trance, a peaceful diminishment of coercive control, the rise of a leader who channels civic energy without precipitating revenge, and a relatively smooth opening to international assistance that stabilizes the economy. This outcome would likely produce a regional ripple, neighboring countries recalibrating diplomatic ties, a possible return of investment, and migration flows altering as conditions improve. A more sober scenario recognizes the risk of partial transitions, elite bargaining that reshapes power without fully addressing underlying grievances, a caretaker government that buys time but fails to deliver structural reform, or an external actor whose involvement produces short-term order at the cost of long-term instability. In this frame, the imagery of white-clad crowds and 3 days of silence may be real, but insufficient to secure a durable democratic or economic turn. The military's choices, not to shoot, to stand down, or to broker a deal, remain the fulcrum. The trance's focus on the military's behavioral shift is therefore not mystical so much as strategic. It highlights precisely the axis that scholars identify as decisive in many transitions. A third scenario, darker, involves active interference or violent backlash. While the trance, as reported, emphasizes nonviolence, analysts remind us that transitions can provoke severe counterattacks, that polarization can harden, and that external actors may have interests that encourage a contested outcome. Importantly, the file's vision of a peaceful collapse does not preclude attempts at violent suppression. It depends on many contingencies beyond the dream imagery. That is why balanced analysis does not rest on prophetic promise. Across all scenarios, a recurring theme from the archive story is the power of belief. If a critical mass of citizens and elites come to see a prophetic timeline as plausible, their actions may become self-fulfilling in specific ways, mobilizing resources, coordinating nonviolent actions, or recalibrating calculations inside the military and political class. At the same time, belief can produce risky overconfidence, misreading of signals, or premature mobilization that provokes repression. The trance, therefore, functions as both mirror and motor. It reflects hopes and fears already present in society, and it can accelerate or distort the very dynamics it purports to describe. What should observers, inside Venezuela and beyond, do with this mixture of prophecy, archive claims, and present-day indicators? First, keep the distinction clear. Treat the trance as a reported historical artifact whose interpretive value depends on provenance and context. Verify celestial or archival matches where possible. Consult independent sources for institutional indicators. And be cautious about elevating one narrative to determinative status. Second, center the lives of those most affected. Conversations about prophetic timing must not eclipse the immediate practical needs of people confronting shortages, displacement, and insecurity. Third, watch for signs that belief is affecting behavior in measurable ways. Coordinated protests timed to symbolic dates, shifts in elite messaging that echo prophetic language, or public diplomacy that references nonviolent transition narratives. Those are actionable observations even if one remains agnostic about supernatural claims. As the calendar tightens toward the year many interpreters identify, and as social media turns every event into possible confirmation or refutation, the political and humanitarian stakes remain high. If the trance's most hopeful reading were to unfold, it could mean relief for millions, restored services, freer political life, and the possibility of rebuilding institutions. If it fails, the consequences could include demoralization, greater repression, or a protracted period of instability. Neither prospect should elicit triumphalism. Both demand sober, prepared responses from communities, civil society, and international partners. In the end, what the archive story offers is not a neat prediction, but a lens, one among many, through which to read a complex present. It compresses narrative desires for closure, moral yearning for exemplars, and the human habit of locating meaning in coincidence. Whether or not the trance proves to have anticipated events in a literal sense, its circulation influences politics by setting expectations and shaping behavior. That is the key lesson for anyone following the lead-up to 2026. Prophecy matters not because it is incontrovertibly true, but because belief in prophecy can alter the course of events. Whatever unfolds, there is a moral frame worth holding. Advocate for peaceful methods, protect the dignity and safety of civilians, and insist on independent verification of extraordinary archival claims. If the documents are authentic and the images accurate, their promise, a peaceful renewal led by civic resolve, would be a rare and hopeful outcome. If the documents are not definitive, the story still performs a civic function by focusing attention on institutional fragilities and public aspirations. Either way, the human stakes are real and immediate. Share your perspective below. Did the parallels and the archival claims change how you see the coming months? Were you persuaded by the symbolic readings, or do you remain skeptical? Discuss respectfully and cite sources where possible. This conversation matters for how communities interpret evidence and prepare for possible futures. If you found this investigation useful, consider sharing it with someone who is watching these developments closely.